There's a piece of me that I'm not quite sure how I want to get started still with tonight's class. Last week, we talked about what? Does anybody remember what we talked about last week? You know, I'm always going to start off with this. Any takers? Meat, okay, that had something to do with some spiritual maturity. Good job, Cleo. And I got a special shout out to Cleo because he knows. All right, growing from milk and meat. Did we talk of anything about, being relaxed and comfortable? Relaxed and comfortable? I heard somebody over here, yes. Breaking boundaries, yes, absolutely. Yep. And who was the focus of most of our discussion? Sorry? Starts with a P and ends with a eater. Yep, Peter, good job. Yep. So we've been really starting off with something that was very basic, right? And when we discussed those very basic things, we all agreed that, yeah, those are pretty basic. And David, it sounds like what you're teaching is biblical. And we don't have any disagreements about that. We believe that God's word's inspired. We believe that God's word is useful. We believe that it's encouraging. And we kind of moved on from there. And then last week, we did talk about being able to break out of our comfort zones and had some thoughts around, are we too comfortable? Does our experience as Christians in Woodland Oaks and in the United States, and particularly a little bit further south than a lot of other people, does that make us comfortable? And I actually had some folks come up to me afterwards and say, David, I was going to tell you that we should expect. Oh, there you are, Mac. So now I see you. I didn't see you earlier. So Mac was one of the folks that said, hey, we're not meant to be comfortable. It's okay for us to experience discomfort. It's actually a good sign of experiencing persecution, and blessed are those who are persecuted. We didn't really discuss that, but I want to make sure that we give airtime to that tonight. So we really focused a lot on Peter and the fact that he had this transformation. He went through all these different things. We have a lot of different thoughts about him, but he was human, and he still had all these influences that impacted everything that he did. Well, tonight, we're going to continue. I don't know if you remember, but I said I had two examples that kind of illustrated the point that we're really trying to get through last week, and we're going to continue that this week with Paul. So, what do we know about the Apostle Paul? I'm not the first person that's ever taught about Paul. So, what do we know about Paul? All right, he was Saul at one time. Thinking scripturally, is there any significance behind the name of a Jewish person named Saul? Can we think of any other people named Saul? Yeah? Okay, the first king. Okay, very good. So y'all are tracking along very well. That's good. So Saul had some significance in the name, and it was Saul of Tarsus. What else do we know about Paul, Saul of Tarsus? Okay, hold on just a second. So Mike was mentioning that he is highly educated. He's a Pharisee. All right, and yes. Okay, highly educated. So in the sense of highly educated, is that something that even now in our culture that we hold in high regard? So I heard yes immediately. So most of us talk about when you're giving updates on your kids. Does anybody talk about how kids are doing academically, how they're doing in school? Yes. And we talk about a progression of that, and we think a little bit broader than that, and depending on where you go, you'll get questions about, what school did you go to? what school is your child thinking about going to, right? All of those things matter, and they mattered then. Yes, Glenn? Okay, so whatever Paul did, he was all in. And I'm glad you mentioned that, because we're going to talk a little bit about Paul's background. And there are some people that think that because he carried the name of Saul, and because of Saul's dividedness as King Saul, where at first he was a godly man, and then later, everything went off the rails for Saul, and he totally changed, everything about himself, and we wouldn't say that he ended up as a godly man? Yes. Yeah, very, very zealous. So, yes, so Richard brings up that not only was he very knowledgeable, he was action-oriented. I think somebody else said that he was all in. Some people suggest that some of that came from he was going to make sure that when people thought of Saul, they were going to see a godly man that King Saul was supposed to be. But anyways, I thought that was kind of interesting that some folks saw Saul in that regard, in the way that he was living his life as a devout Pharisee. He was also a persecutor. So tell me more. What does that mean? What does it mean to be a persecutor?
Well, he held the cloaks of those who stoned Stephen.
Okay.
He went and persecuted Christians.
Okay. So he was present at Stephen's execution of his stoning, and then he carried out letters to go and persecute Christians. In Paul and in Saul, we see a huge transformation, don't we? We see huge transformation. How many of you are familiar with where Saul is from? A little bit? Okay, I saw a couple of hands. Where is he from? Okay, where in the world is Tarsus? Okay, modern day Turkey, I heard. Okay, what about Tarsus? Why would it matter? Why would he carry that name with him? Why would people associate that with him? What about Tarsus mattered? What's that? It made him a Roman, and probably when he was born, they probably had rule over there for like 70 or so years. But what's really interesting is Tarsus, where he was from, had one of the top universities in the ancient world. One of the top institutions of higher learning. And so we talk and we focus a lot about his upbringing as an educated person from a Pharisee's point of view and from his teachers. But where he was from was a very, very important town, an important city. It was the land of, does anybody know what ancient history Tarsus has? There's a person, I think we've referred to him before, but had a pretty cool name, ruled Macedonia. All right, so a really important place culturally, ancient-wise, historically. This is where Paul is from. And I thought it was really interesting because I never really spent a lot of time thinking about Paul or Saul's background as being from what at that point in time was considered Minor Asia. We refer to it as Minor Asia, because I always saw him as a Pharisee. So I always associated with wherever he was from, regardless of how I looked at the map, as being close to Jerusalem. Because how could he be a Pharisee, and how could he train under Gamaliel if he didn't spend a lot of time there? But understanding some about Paul's hometown helps us also understand the way that he related to people. And we'll also discuss a little bit about his family. So Tarsus was a really important city. It was on a major trade route, had an institute of higher learning, significant influence, Roman, Greek, all the different things that you'd come to expect. And Paul's background, where we learn that he becomes a Pharisee, that he is a Pharisee, also means a few things about his family, which we'll get into in a little bit later. But so what about Paul's transformation on the road to Damascus? Why is that someone like him with that background, why is that something that was dangerous to the Jews? All right. So because of him being a Pharisee and the Pharisees having a sham of a trial, okay, that could be dangerous with having somebody like Saul convert. Can you think of anybody where if you saw them change right now, that's a leading figure in sports or entertainment or politics, or it would be like just mind-blowing, earth-shattering, like people would fall over, just unbelievable? I'm sorry? Okay, so if I went around the room, we could all probably name a few, right? Just such a total difference. Well, with Saul and his transformation, he experienced something that I don't even know how to imagine it. You know, to be on your way to go and persecute other people and having the mind that you are the most devout person and you're protecting your heritage and your traditions and everything about the God Yahweh, and then to be blinded on the way. And to spend time in that condition, and then to have somebody come and to teach you, and then be baptized, just a total about-face. It is hard for me to wrap my mind around that transformation. So I asked you to think a little bit about why something like that would be threatening to Jewish leaders. But when we think about somebody like Paul, is that dramatic transformation really all that unexpected from people that choose to become followers of Christ?
The spiritual transformation is not easy for people in the world to see.
Okay, so you're saying that the spiritual transformation is not easy for the world to see. All right? So if you have a spiritual transformation, John, and I think you shared a little bit about your story once before in a class that I was teaching, but would the world be able to tell that you have changed your life? It should, right? So because of Saul's background, more prestige, whatever it is, the transformation may look a little bit different, but in reality, for anybody that becomes a Christian, that dramatic transformation should be seen, right? It should be evident. And so in some ways, like, for me, it's thinking about it like, wow, what a big change. But then at the other hand, that's the way the change is supposed to be. It's supposed to be dramatic. It's supposed to be different. It's supposed to be something that's easy to see. So having your beliefs challenged, your comfort zone challenged, your life, the course, the direction, everything about your life being changed or challenged because of following Christ should be hand in hand with the experience. Yeah, so we're going to look at the duration of some of the events, so I'm glad you bring it up, that what we see in the way that Paul goes on and on the missionary journeys is after a time of, we don't really know a whole lot of what he was doing, but we can assume that he was studying, we can assume that he was teaching, we can assume that he was growing spiritually because we see it, yes. Yeah, so there's a lot of things that we can guess and assume about what was taking place with Saul. We see the evidence of it, right? We see the evidence of the change. And if you read through the book of Acts and some of these things, they seem more immediate. They seem more like, oh, okay, well, he went and did this, and then he went and did that. But you don't necessarily always have the time drawn out. So I appreciate you bringing that up. We'll look at that in a little bit as well, in more detail. What kind of life did Paul leave when he converted? What kind of life did he leave? Okay, so he was well respected. He was at the pinnacle of his career. Yeah, well respected. Yeah, so, I mean, clearly he had some type of sway. Powerful. Yeah, so if we were to go back and we were to read in Acts chapter 6 and verse 8, we can read where Stephen is apprehended and brought before the Sanhedrin. Now, we don't know exactly, it's not exactly outlined in Scripture about where Saul was sitting, but Saul was present while Stephen spoke to the Sanhedrin as he was stoned at the event. So some people suggest that Saul was also a member of the Sanhedrin, and that would have been approximately one of 10 or so Pharisees on that council. Now, I didn't read that anywhere specifically, but there are some folks that make that jump, that he was present there, and because of some of the actions that he has with the letters and chasing after folks, and him being physically present when he's brought before the council, that's the case. So he had prominence and he had influence in his background. Again, none of this is necessarily new as far as this is the type of stuff that we're taught all the time, right, about Saul, about changing over to Paul. So he left that, and then what do we read about with Saul and what he goes through? All right, so he's not immediately accepted by Christians. What does that mean? Okay, so they didn't know what to think of this guy that was murdering Christians. Like, can we really trust this dude? Can we really put our faith and trust in that he has done an about face and that he is not just trying to get into the way so that he can persecute and kill more Christians? Well, that sounds a pretty difficult place to be. Yeah, aren't you when you become a Christian, aren't you supposed to come down here and everybody gathers around and they put your arms around you and you sing, we're all part of the family and that kind of thing? Like, isn't that what's supposed to happen? So it's a big difference with Paul. So I said earlier I wanted to spend a little bit of time with some different aspects of Saul and why he would be such a threat to the Jews of the day. And we touched a little bit about what some of the Christians thought. But Paul was taught by Gamaliel, right? In his own account, he talks about Gamaliel. What do we know about Gamaliel? Any takers? All right. Hold on just a sec. Yes. Yep. That's correct. Hey, we had these specific individuals go and pretend to be the Messiah, and they all died off. And the same thing's going to happen with these folks if what they're saying is true or not. So that's one aspect, and that's in Acts chapter 5 and verses 34 through 40. I saw a couple of other hands. All right, so same story, same example. All right, so Gamaliel was a prominent Jewish rabbi, member of the Sanhedrin, the highest Jewish council during the time of Jesus in the early church. We learn about him in Acts, and we learn about him both from that illustration and from Paul's account. He was born into a renowned family, one of the most respected Jewish families known for their scholarship and leadership. That's Gamaliel. He was a grandson of a famous Jewish sage named Hillel, Hillel, the elder. So Gamaliel received a comprehensive education in Jewish law. He was a prominent Pharisee and he was a rabbi. All right, so he was a respected member of the Sanhedrin, the supreme council of Jewish elders, judges, scholars in Jerusalem. And he played a significant role in shaping Jewish legal and religious matters during the first century. He was highly, highly esteemed. And as that story in Acts chapter 5 illustrates, he had a reputation for being fair. He had a reputation for being wise. He was recognized for his knowledge of Jewish law and traditions. And his student was Paul. His student was Paul. Now, you can learn more about Gamaliel. He's found in the Babylonian Talmud, which I haven't ever spent a lot of time in, but that one's more widely studied. He's also found in the Jerusalem Talmud, the writings of Josephus, and a more recent thing called the Jewish Encyclopedia. So Gamaliel is notable in the context of understanding more about Saul.
That was probably one of the wisest things. It's very impressive that he said, if it's going to be a problem, we'll worry about it.
Yeah, so John brings up, how wise his statements were about just watching this whole thing just kind of flame out. It's kind of interesting to me that his student acted differently. Yeah. So he had a long-lasting impact on early Judaism. He had an impact on Christianity through Saul. But he is somebody that has been written about and thought about, and his family very, very esteemed. Yes, Roger. it connects with people, or your wife connects with people, or your children connect with people, or your grandparents. Like there's a lot that goes into that. And we see that really, really clear with somebody like Saul, right? He's from an area where he would know all of the culture of the Greeks and the Gentiles and all of the culture of the Jews. And he was fed the finest tradition of Jewish everything from his family until he reached the age to go and study under a rabbi, which his family must have had some type of connection for him to work with such an esteemed rabbi. And he turned away from every ounce of that when he converted.
And he wrote a big part of the New Testament, and that education probably helped him a great deal.
So the penmanship and the writing and the organizing of all types of things from the churches and elders and deacons to the writings that we have. Now, you want to talk about comfort and discomfort. I didn't convert out of something that my family had held on to for 150, 1,000 years. Like, I didn't convert out of that. I don't know what that is like to have that experience. But it didn't just end there. Like, when Saul has this experience and he converts, we talk about all the things that he does, things don't get any easier for him. Like, it's a miserable experience in a lot of ways. Like, I haven't been imprisoned. Like, I haven't gone to jail. I haven't served time. I haven't had to do that for, crime or because I'm a Christian. Yet that's what he went through. He went through different missionary journeys that took him all around the world. And it was all because he converted. Did you look at my notes? No. Yeah, so, if you contrast Saul's experience to that in Matthew and Mark, politically, who's a greater threat to the established system? You're looking at the pinnacle of power, of privilege, of education, converting to what those people hated and despised, that felt so compelled that they were right and Jesus was wrong, that they murdered him. They killed him. The one that they had waited their whole lives to see, that their whole family and their family's family, that everybody had seen, they were so consumed and caught up with it that they crucified Christ. And then you see this guy that was going out and doing all the same type of things, doing the right thing for their faith, convert. Paul didn't do that. It wasn't easy. He knew lots of stuff, obviously. But it wasn't just challenging to them, it was challenging to Christians. What were they supposed to do with a guy like him? What were they supposed to do with a guy like him? And then, out of all the people to be legalistic, you would think he would be the one that was legalistic. Right? He had all the trainings on all the rituals and all the right things that you're supposed to do. Where you're supposed to sit in the pew, which time you're supposed to be in the building, which Bible class you're supposed to go to, how to properly hold the cup when you take communion. Like, Paul knew all that stuff, right? what does Paul carry with him in light of all of those things? What does he describe himself as? Chief of sinners, least. Did he carry a great debt? When he converted, after watching the persecution and knowing that he was responsible for killing people, did that go away when he converted? No. He carried that with him. That legalism and the strict adherence to everything was flipped because of what he was forgiven. It was changed because of what he was forgiven. And that created some problems for folks that wanted to keep the Jewish traditions and bind those on the Gentile converts, which we spoke about when he spoke to Peter in our class last week. All right, so we talked about Paul, we talked about his background, we talked about his teacher, and why he would be such a threat. They wanted him gone, eliminated, silenced, disappeared, right? All these different experiences we see. So we have the conversion on the road to Damascus, and I'm giving my hat tip to you. He preaches in Damascus, in the synagogues, and people that heard him teach were astonished that he would proclaim that Jesus is the Son of God. If you read Galatians chapter 1, let's go ahead and turn over there real quick. Galatians chapter 1, starting in verse 11 and continuing on to chapter 2, Paul talks a little bit about what his experience was. And in my Bible, I get an editorial on different things, and the one that they give me here is Paul is called by God. In verse 11, he says, I want you to know, brothers, the gospel I preached is not something that man made up. Now, this is really interesting to me. I did not receive it from any man, nor was I taught it, whether I received it by revelation from Jesus Christ. For you have heard of my previous way of life in Judaism, how intensely I persecuted the church of God and tried to destroy it. I was advancing in Judaism beyond many Jews of my own age and was extremely zealous for the traditions of my fathers. But when God, who set me apart from birth and called me by his grace, was pleased to reveal his Son in me so that I might preach him among the Gentiles, I did not consult any man, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to see those who were apostles before I was. But I went immediately into Arabia and later returned to Damascus. Then after 3 years, I went up to Jerusalem to get acquainted with Peter and stayed with him 15 days. I saw none of the other apostles, only James, the Lord's brother. I assure you before God that what I am writing to you is no lie. Later, I went to Syria and Cilicia. I was personally unknown to the churches of Judea that are in Christ. They only heard the report, the man who formerly persecuted us is now preaching the faith he once tried to destroy. And they praised God because of me. 14 years later, I went up again to Jerusalem, this time with Barnabas. I took Titus along also. I went in response to a revelation and set before them the gospel that I preach among the Gentiles. But I did this privately to those who seemed to be leaders, for fear that I was running or had run my race in vain. Now, when you read through Acts, you don't necessarily get that time breakup of what Paul was doing or what he was experiencing and how he was or wasn't welcomed among the apostles. We don't get to see what his experiences were. But then this guy, Barnabas, shows up, and Paul's visit to Jerusalem. So, Paul preaches in Damascus. They try to kill him. Seems like the story of his life moving on. But his followers help save him. We don't know who they were. We just read that it was his followers helped save him through an opening in the city wall, allowing him to escape and to continue his mission to preach the gospel. So he has this visit. He visits with two apostles. And in some ways, to me, it's almost like an evaluation. You know, what are you teaching? How are you teaching it? Is it okay? How did you learn it? How is it given to you? Like, do you come from the right background? Like, is it okay? But he returns later, 14 years later, with Barnabas. Now, what's interesting is, what do we think about Barnabas? Son of, encouragement. Anything else come up with Barnabas? Forgiving. Where did he preach and teach? Does anybody recall that? There's a place where they were first called Christians. Antioch. Did you know that Antioch, relatively speaking, is not that far from Tarsus? And there are some people that suggest that because of his upbringing, he didn't feel as comfortable working in Antioch, and he called on Paul. Now, it's conjecture, it's guess, it's different things as far as like how Paul and Barnabas ultimately came together and to teach. But Paul goes on to teach in Antioch. And it's almost like Jerusalem East in some ways. That church does some great work. And they send Paul and Barnabas all over the world. But they were Greek, Gentiles. They didn't have the historical, we went to Jerusalem, we heard what was happening with the way, and we went out back to our homes. This was a different setup. What was happening in Antioch was so fascinating to the Jewish leaders in Jerusalem that they sent Barnabas there. Now that's impact. What was happening at that church so gave curiosity and interest that they sent Barnabas there. Barnabas connects with Paul. They teach there. Paul and Barnabas go on to do great things. Despite the initial skepticism, he's introduced to the apostles. He's allowed to preach about Jesus in Jerusalem. And what a fascinating, come around circle. And if we move on to Acts chapter 14, where we talk about the stoning, in Lystra, Paul was stoned by a crowd, left for dead, and drug outside the city. Now, Glenn, you got a different job than a lot of us. I mean, what kind of state is a person left in that people assume that they're no longer living, drag them out, leave them for dead, because they are dead? He had to go through some pretty tough stuff being stoned, and everybody assuming that he is dead. But the interesting thing is that just before that, they were in a different city preaching. And those people there ran them off and chased them here to stir up trouble. and they got Paul and left for dead. However, he miraculously survived. Then if you continue on into Acts chapter 16, Paul has a vision of somebody from Macedonia asking for help. Paul answers the call. And then we end up with the churches in Philippi, Thessalonica, and Berea. And what do we know about the Bereans? Noble character? Okay. They were students. They tested what they heard. They tested what they were exposed to. Now, he goes on to preach in Athens in Acts chapter 17, trying to reach the intellectuals. And when I thought about that, I thought about his background, being a good student, but I didn't realize that he was at Tarsus with one of the best universities. And he knew all this stuff, and so of course he could make a compelling argument to those folks that were quabbling and listening to fascinating stories day in and day out there in Athens. We know that Paul goes on to get arrested in Jerusalem, accused of causing a riot. Now, how many of you have ever been to a prison modern day? All right, not a comfortable place, but in ancient times, like just nasty, filthy, even worse than like what we can think of. And that's where he was. Paul had to change everything, and it cost him everything, physically and family-wise. I hope that while we look at Paul's life and we reflect on what he's done and what he went through, that we're reminded that growth and transformation happens when we allow ourselves to be used by God. God's glory will shine through us, and his incredible plan for our lives will be revealed. And it's my hope that as a community of believers that we have the faith and boldness to step beyond our traditional comfort zones so that we can bring glory and honor to God. Thank you for your attention tonight.